Morning, everybody. The next panel will begin shortly. My name is Brianne Letta, and I am a student ambassador for the VaynerMedia Council conferences this week. Thank you so much for a fantastic discussion in our last panel. Our next session is Inside New York Politics, City, Island, and State. It features Harry Siegel, senior editor at the Daily Beast, columnist at the New York Daily News, and co-host of the FAQ NYC podcast, Yancy Roy, Albany Bureau Chief for Newsday, and Steve Burns, reporter for WCBS News Radio 880. Moderating is Carol Dioria, reporter and anchor at 1010 Wins. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the Q&A box. Good morning, Carol.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
There you go. Okay. Good morning. This is a pretty exciting topic as far as I'm concerned. And I think all of us, this is a brand new year, brand new administration in Washington. One of the things I'd like to talk about this morning is the impact that Washington will have on New York City and Long Island. Being out every day in the field and interviewing citizens, politicians, I have so often talked to people who were Donald Trump supporters, and they look at the administration now and they're thinking, my taxes are going to go through the roof, and they have a doomsday scenario. At the same time, I talk to people who are Democrats, supporters of the president, and they go, oh, finally, we're going to get things back on track and they can breathe. That's what they've told me. And so one of the things I'd like to talk about is, usually the truth is somewhere in the middle. What you think Long Islanders and city folks can really expect from the Biden administration, the day-to-day impact that that administration will have on our lives here. How is it really going to change? Because as you talk to politicians locally, and sometimes you get an idea of how they're lining their ducks up in a row in the background. So if we could start with that and get some ideas about what people can expect, and then we can get into some of the nitty gritty and some of the specific issues. But overall, I see that as the umbrella hanging over us at the moment. Yancy, do you want to start with that?
Well, I mean, look, there's so many things that happen on a local level that kind of hinge on what's going on in Washington, right? Right now, to give you a little bit of context, the state budget, Governor Cuomo just presented what he wants to do with the state budget just last week. It has to be adopted by April 1, supposedly, with lawmakers. And what he did here was sort of say, I've got a two-step approach, which is a little bit unusual. He said, we're going to present a plan with a lot of DC help and not so much DC help. And that's going to turn out to affect what we do on schools, what on income tax rates, what we do for colleges, what we might do for state university tuition. So yeah, it's all so much of what's going to happen in New York right now is really dependent on what might happen in Washington over the next month, what with the new administration and the new Congress. And so everything is kind of waiting on this like trickle down effect from what happened. So it's a big year and a lot of big questions to be answered.
Exactly. And we're talking $1.9 trillion, what he calls American Rescue Package. That's a lot of money flying around. And what gets passed probably won't be near that. But you're right. That's what the devil is going to be in the details when it all starts to trickle down. Maybe we can go to Harry Siegel, senior editor of the Daily Beast. What are your thoughts? Is he there?
Yeah.
Oh, there he is. Good morning.
Thank you. Since March for a lot of this, and it's been a really interesting one. So you've had Mayor de Blasio with the countdown clock up, not to how much time he has left in office, which now is ending this year, but throughout last year, to how much time hopefully the Trump administration has left, right? And when help is coming, the cavalry is coming. You've had people running for mayor who, for similar reasons, because Lord knows what things are going to look like in 2022 in terms of public health and the vaccine, in terms of schools, in terms of help from Washington and from Albany, sort of talking around these biggest issues. So it's been like a math problem, X plus Y equals Z, what's X? And no one wants to talk about that. There's just been too much uncertainty. So what's helpful for New York and Long Island right now, the state and then the region and the city, is we know who some of the players are. We know that they're going to operate in more normative ways and with a more sympathetic eye toward New York. So we're now getting 100%, for instance, of disaster relief reimbursed instead of 75%. You can put a hard number on that, so it's not an X. You have some sense of what the processes are and when we'll find out and what it'll mean if we're going to get money for Gateway, for big infrastructure things, more of the help we need to maybe get schools open. So you can start having those conversations again and stop having these sort of endless delay tactics that we're going to eventually start figuring this out. And obviously there's been some good news in the interim, and people have used the worst case scenario, Cuomo included, a little bit as a negotiating tool or a cudgel. So the drop in tax revenues, which is severe, is not as severe as had been projected and anticipated by the city and the state a few months ago. That's great. Having Schumer as majority leader is certainly going to be helpful for New York. But now, if the equation instead of X plus Y equals Z, what's X? We still have two and a half variables left. And people are going to have to start making real governing decisions, like filling out budget numbers and numbers they're largely held to. This is, again, tricky in Albany because Cuomo's done this special thing where he gets to just adjust the budget quarterly because of the emergency circumstances. And the legislature sort of has to say, but only if they want it, which they won't. So this is definitely better for New York. It's not good enough. What's helpful is we can start looking more seriously and honestly at the hole we're in, how deep it is, and what we need to start doing from here with a little less sense of unpredictability. And, my God, what is the future going to bring as the president's been more and more different than we've had up until now?
Exactly. That's a good point. You will start to fill in some of the numbers so that it's not quite such a maze of or a mass of unknown. And especially with things like one that comes to mind is the Long Island Railroad. Ridership now only 25% of what it had been during pre-pandemic, and the budget hole. Now, Biden, of course, has promised to fill in so much of what Pat Foy, the head of the MTA, wants. But you still have on the horizon routes that are going to be cut. They have to. I mean, there's just not enough money to go around. And so there really is going to be quite an impact when all the dust settles. And it might not be for quite a while with this, with the pandemic hanging over our heads and the vaccine. Talk about an unknown. how this has happened where we have people waiting. Cuomo keeps saying he's got the infrastructure to have people vaccinated, and yet, there's no vaccine. And of course, President Biden saying, no, don't worry, we're going to get it. Where have I heard that before? So I think I hear a lot of people saying things like that. In terms of, well, I will get to that, but I want to hear from Steve Burns. Steve and I do things a little differently from Yancey and Harry. Radio is more immediate. It's what's happening right this minute. And so we have a little bit of a different take, I think, on things. So why don't we bring in Steve? Are you there?
Yes, I'm here. How are you, Carol?
Ah, there you are. Okay. I should just a little bit of trivia. Steve and I work for different radio stations. He's at News Radio 88. I'm at 1010 Wins, but we are owned by the same company. But we function like two different radio stations who we've never been in each other's building. So, Steve, what's your take on what we might expect, and what in talking to people on the street and talking to the politicians, what you think they're looking for?
Well, in addition to what's already been mentioned, I think it's really important to note, looking at the mayor's race right now, it's almost everyone's trying to get in front of each other and saying, look at this connection I have in Washington. I know the vice president. I know the president. We all have these connections that we can leverage. But yeah, I think we are unusually reliant right now on the federal government, given how many budget problems we are seeing. And I think it's important to highlight the transportation and the infrastructure aspect of this as well, given that the Trump administration was kind of a bottleneck to so many really important transportation projects in the New York City area. Gateway was mentioned. Congestion pricing is another big one that could be coming. We just saw the city council speaker, Corey Johnson, send a letter to the transportation secretary nominee, Pete Buttigieg, saying we need to get this off the ground as soon as possible. For unknown reasons, it was kind of left on the desk in the Trump administration, needed federal approval. It didn't get it. So they're hoping to get that off the ground as soon as possible as well. And Second Avenue subway is obviously another big one. So in addition to all those other things, it could be kind of a remaking of New York's transportation landscape in the Biden administration here.
Exactly. And it's been such a strange year just from a reporting aspect. I can't remember when one issue, the pandemic, dominated the news every single day. We always cover the mayor, we always cover the governor, but not the way we do now. It's like, that's how we start our day, is what are they saying today? And so, so many of these other issues that you just mentioned, the Second Avenue subway, congestion pricing, I haven't heard those words in quite a while, because it's the pandemic has just colored everything and covered over everything else, because people's survival was really there. One of the things I wanted to talk about is Governor Cuomo and the vaccine, how he handled that. I can remember early on when he did his daily updates for the media, and he's been counting down every day. I think we're up to day 300 and something. I can't remember what the exact number is. He was seen as this star. He got the Emmy Award for his daily briefings. But now I'm hearing people say things aren't going the way they wanted. We've got COVID fatigue sneaking in there. People are getting tired of this. So what I'm wondering is how Governor Cuomo is going to be plotting and planning for, just like, for instance, for this year. He's pushing for the vaccine. He has plenty of infrastructure, he claims. What's he really thinking? And what's going on with him? Yancey, can you shed any light on that?
Sure. I'll jump in, pick up the ball here. I think that, you mentioned early last year, and he started the briefings in March, so we are almost coming on one full year of those. I think in part those were well viewed and well reviewed, because there was like a vacuum of information from the federal government. And so much of it, New York was hit so hard at the beginning, unlike other states. And so there was like a craving for information for people all over. And that's why he was getting so many views from not just New York but other states as well. Now you fast forward to where we are now, and while the daily sort of briefings about how many people tested and how many positive and where we are still of information, still of a point of information for people. Right now, everyone has shifted focus to the vaccine. How many do we have? How does the process work to get registered? And so now the rollout of this, which has all sorts of frustrations and problems for people. It's going to be test not just Cuomo's leadership, but the incoming Biden administration, and even sort of on a local level with counties and hospitals and what have you. So, I think we're in a critical point right now in terms of how Cuomo will eventually be viewed as handling this, and that's how quickly and how efficiently are a lot of people able to get vaccinated. And I think this kind of goes back to your first question about Washington and kind of trickle down ideas. Is right now the big holdup is production and how many vaccines get to New York and other states. And what we're seeing and what everybody is reporting on is sites that started to register people but couldn't honor appointments or couldn't hold appointments because they're unsure of the vaccine supply. So it's a real to go back to the start here, it's been a real shift for Cuomo to be from trying to inform people at the beginning and just give people an understanding of the status of things to now carrying out an operation, so to speak, of getting the vaccines out there.
I want to, at this point, we have a question here from someone in the audience. How disjointed is information coming out of DC in terms of what it means for the city, island, and state? How do we make sense of what it means for our region? Well, that's sort of what we've been talking about. And, Cuomo, as you said, early on, he was this person giving out all the information we needed. But then people started to get angry as months went on. The nursing home problem with the nursing home deaths, people are really upset about that. And you still have New York City shut down in terms of no indoor dining. And as you drive around, I mean, I'm a person who I work out of my car, so I drive around all the time. Steve, probably the same thing. And it's like a ghost town. So I'm wondering how, I mean, he's got so many of these ups and downs, so many really good things, and then these other things that people want to hold against him. Do you, either of you, Harry or Steve, have any gut feeling, Harry, about what we might see in terms of opening up New York City? I mean, we have California, they wanted to recall him, and then, okay, we'll end the lockdown there. You have any thoughts about that?
I do. Going back a couple things that have been brought up here, and I'm going to come right back to that. I wrote something in April. If you're watching these briefings for free, you're a sucker. And all of us on this call, we have reasons to be tuning into these. But fundamentally, if Donald Trump, when he was president, Governor Cuomo, Mayor Bill de Blasio just wanted to give the numbers, they could do that in 15 seconds. Right? If they needed to reflect a little or explain a change in things, they could do that in 1 minute. If they need to answer questions about that specific new thing they'd announced, again, those are all very simple, straightforward exercises. And on a fundamental level, a lot of this was about having TV time and in a pecking order, right? So they were competing at first, but eventually it was de Blasio had to go first in the mornings. Cuomo got to speak in the middle after him. And he tried to go into prime time, but Trump pushed him back. And Trump, who pushed the doctors off stage, and then this was just the wacky Trump show with no numbers, and these were nominally briefings, but they were just Trump talking about things, largely. That whole thing is very unhealthy, and it's what all politicians on a fundamental level want, even in the midst of a crisis. It's I'm setting the agenda, I'm telling you what the story is for today, and they're holding these numbers, dangling them for the end of these briefings, or after their fireside chats or 30-minute monologues or anecdotes about their daughters and their boyfriends and all that nonsense, because that's a ratings game. Cuomo is now in a less successful season 2, but he got a best-selling book out of season 1. He had a special when this ended before his Emmy, where he looked back on like 100 and however many briefings, and there was like mood music and
He was being
flashbacks.
talked about as a bachelor, and women were watching him on TV because he was this eligible bachelor.
Mhm. And there was homosexuality out there. My goodness. And so we're at this moment of really great uncertainty about when the economy opens up, what it looks like when it does. And the big thing we're going to start finding out with the Biden administration is who's going to eat how much of the massive losses that are stacked up and how massive those are. So there's so much money to go around, and either tenants have to pay some of it, landlords have to pay some of it, they have to eat it, banks have to eat it, or the government has to eat it. The government, and for these purposes, representing, an umbrella with the taxes from all those earlier groups plus borrowing. And we just don't know. So we have an eviction moratorium, but it's putting off all those hard decisions. We don't know this for how much the city's going to have to eat versus the state versus the feds. So again and again and again, we just don't know who's going to have to take how hard a hit out of how many dollars, how many people are going to get evicted, how many banks are going to have to report bad earnings, my goodness, no, to their shareholders, where any of this ends up. And consequently, we just don't know what reopening really means and looks like. We do know Cuomo is impatient to get there. We know he'll change standards in the middle of things, in the middle of Supreme Court cases or other things. Hey, we have yellow zones, but they're not relevant anymore because we're not really doing that. So you don't need Supreme Court to respond to whether or not this is constitutional. It's all been made up. And I'm not faulting anyone below former President Trump for this, because when there is no message at all from the top, and so all these other people who are supposed to be in a middle role with what they're rolling out, right? If you're the governor, you control a lot, especially the governor of New York, the most powerful governor in the country. You control a lot, but fundamentally, you need to know what help is coming from Washington, to know how much money you have to make decisions. And you need to know what people are actually going to do, because you can't police everyone into staying inside. That's ridiculous. So a lot of what you're announcing only works if on some level it's consensual. And people are getting very impatient now, more so with the vaccine. There are obvious risks of having a new public health crisis emerge out of that. And we are running short on time. The economy is running short on time, and these decisions will get more difficult. The hope is that the Biden administration can competently handle the logistics of getting the vaccine out, that we're near an endpoint, that we can buy just a little bit of time and patience, which is when moral messaging can really be good and useful. And these TV shows have some value, and we can get through this, but that's far from a certainty. And if we don't get there, what's coming up ahead is really scary. Mm-hmm. and very hard to see. Beyond here, dragons.
You don't hear what?
Beyond this point, they used to have on the Legend of the Maps, dragons.
Oh, okay. Steve, your thoughts? I see you nodding your head like you're chomping at the bit to say something.
Yeah, no, I would just add, I felt like those early Cuomo briefings in March and April were just kind of filling a void of empathy, where nobody else was providing this kind of, I see what you're going through, look at my daughters, look at my mother, look at all these hard family decisions that I've had to make. It was kind of filling that vacuum that no one else was at that point. But then when you look at the other side of it and the actual execution of policy from the governor, it's often hard to kind of tease out the emotion from the execution. And he's had a lot of stumbles along the way. We talk about vaccine distribution and the excessive amounts of fines that he was imposing on people if they were giving it out too slow or giving it out too fast. All the way back at the beginning, I always think back to those few days where the mayor was saying, we need to think about a shutdown. And the governor sort of got into a semantics battle with him and saying, we can't talk about a shutdown. That's for nuclear disasters and active shooters. We have to think about it in another way. And I believe it was 5 or 6 days later when the governor came up with his New York on pause phraseology, which was essentially a shutdown. And then, of course, studies came out later that had that been done 5 or 6 days earlier, we would have saved an inordinate amount of lives. So you get into, obviously, all these battles between the mayor and the governor. There's been dozens in this almost year since. And, I think people are just eager to have that empathy and that kind of sense of camaraderie of we're all going through this together. But at the same time, you have to tease out some of those policy decisions too. Nursing homes is obviously another one that's been under scrutiny and will definitely be under more scrutiny in the future. You have to kind of tease those out from that empathetic point to see how things are really going here.
And on Long Island, where we have the taxes are just so high. One of the things, Harry, you were saying, how much is everybody going to eat? How much is everybody going to absorb? One of the things for Long Island is the taxes. Are they really going to go that high for us? We got to pay for these projects, a $1.9 trillion project or program, whatever you want to call it. It's a lot of money. We have a question from a participant since we've been talking about COVID. They want to know how each of you has been affected by COVID. How has it impacted your ability to do your job, really? So anybody want to start first?
Well,
Yes.
yeah, I mean, I live in Albany and report from Albany, but I tell you, I've been to the Capitol since this shutdown, to use the phrase that governor didn't want to use, since the sort of shutdown began. I think I've been to the Capitol a handful of times, and to be honest, it's to grab copy paper and batteries and other office supplies. And instead, the way you do your job now is folks follow the state legislature. They've done a lot of stuff through Zoom, through remote voting, and other things. You do a lot of your job through the telephone, through Zoom, through text messages, emails, and that sort of thing. And because the Capitol, more or less, even when you go there, there's hardly anybody there, and that's quite a change for the way New York State government is accustomed to doing business. So it's a sort of normal time. The state Capitol from about February through April 1, and then again in June, is just this beehive of like activity with lawmakers and lobbyists and activists and protest and marching and music and sergeant at arms trying to keep everybody sort of orderly. And as a reporter, it's all right there in front of you, and there are people walking through the what's called the Legislative Correspondents Association working area and stopping by, or you can stop them and find out easily what's going on. Now it's all being done by remote, and that's a little harder. And at the same time, there's also less being done because everything is so focused on the pandemic. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but the number of bills, for example, passed in last year's session was dramatically down. I want to say like half or less. And I don't think it'll be that dramatic again this year. I think once they get past the budget, April 1, there's probably, I would expect a little bit more activity than last year. But everything is kind of slowed down in Albany, which some people might say is a good thing. But to also to look back to what we've kind of been talking about, so many decisions from last year got put off. Everything got put off. What to do about schools? There's a lot of borrowing and temporary aid from the feds to kind of patch the budget through this year, and the governor resisted either acting on the so-called millionaires tax, or on the other end making spending cuts, which is what some fiscal hawks wanted him to do. They gradually gently withheld, I should say gently, they withheld a bunch of money from local governments and schools along the way, like even up to 20% of their operating stuff through the year. Now, what's going to happen this year? There's so much that's been delayed. To get back to a point Harry said, at some point they're going to need some sort of answers to some of these questions, some of which might have, a lot of which will probably have major consequences.
Right. It really COVID took the heat off a lot of those other issues where they were like, oh, at least I don't have to deal with that right now. Harry, we have a question. Steve and others had a question about the books behind you. I mean, this has nothing to do with the news, but people are curious about your books. Are those real books, and have you read them, is the question.
The top row is all comic books. Below that is all books. There are more books on the other side. I've read about 50% of the books. Look, my life has been unaffected compared to a lot of people's. I'm still working. My family has health insurance. We're not having trouble meeting our monthly nut. And that's all like a blessing. And I'm very appreciative when I've seen how disruptive all this has been to other people's lives. And sometimes just frightening, like their life is going on, but they're going out every day, going to work, taking the trains now, coming back home, thinking about their families and who else they might be exposing. It's an incredibly intense moment for all that. And you know, I'm lucky enough to do. I'm sad because I can't go into the Daily Beast office and hoard review books anymore.
And Steve, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I can just give you one real life example from a week ago when there was an event at Al Sharpton's House of Justice in Harlem, and it was a parade of mayoral candidates going up there talking about Martin Luther King Jr. And essentially, it was a pretense to win over that kind of block of voters. And I was about 10 feet or so from the stage, and we had this again parade of mayoral candidates. Comes out a day later that Andrew Yang's staffer had tested positive for COVID-19. Now the staffer wasn't there, but Andrew Yang was. He tested negative that day, but obviously there could be some lag time. So there went my whole week, and I had to stay inside for the rest of the week. I went to get tested twice, and both times came back negative. But yeah, it's an indoor event. You're that close to the stage. You don't want to take any chances. So, I mean, when you ask what's the impact of COVID-19 on the job, I mean, that's it right there. And I know, Carol, you can relate to all the precautions we take at press conferences, making sure everyone has a mask on, Chuck Schumer going up to a podium saying, hey, we'll make this quick. And I think back to some of the early days with Mayor de Blasio as well, when we tried to figure out how to do follow-up questions at a press conference that's virtual. And it got a little bit tougher to kind of hold politicians accountable and make sure they actually answer the question that you're asking them. And thankfully, it was adjusted a little bit. I think a lot of reporters would still like to see a little more flexibility in how that works. But virtual press conferences have definitely been kind of a learning curve in terms of holding politicians accountable.
Right. And, you know, speaking about getting them to answer questions, Steve and I were at, on Sunday, Chuck Schumer, his regular Sunday news conference, and a very different Schumer. I hadn't covered him in several months, you know, on a Sunday like that. And he really cut people short. Steve and I were talking about it right after the news conference. It was like, okay, that's enough. And he would just move on. I never saw that from him. And I thought, oh boy, I mean, okay, I get it. You're busy now because you're the majority leader, but that was something else. And I don't know if that's a harbinger of things to come with him and others. Harry's got a smile on his face.
So not Schumer in that setting, but like metaphorically and literally with these virtual ones, we've given politicians a mute button. And that's just remarkable. And so with de Blasio, we got to follow up questions by various people publicly shaming him at the de Blasio show and using their one question to be like, how come I can't ask follow-ups? This is insane at Potemkin. Right. And if he's clumsy enough and this is new, you can sort of call people out on that, but it's hard. And there's always that give and take with politicians who want to be putting out their own message and then have to answer so many questions to clear a cred bar. And when this happens virtually, like their level of control and staging just goes through the roof. And that, you know, like in that cat and mouse game, whichever side the press is will say the mouse is maybe the cat, but it's in a much tougher starting position.
Yeah. We have a question from an audience member. What you all think Cuomo's chances are politically in the future? Where, you know, what is this going to do for his political future? Help him? Yeah.
I don't know if the sort of final chapter, if you will, of that is written just yet. I mean, there's a long way to go. And until things are quote unquote kind of back to normal, and how do we define that? And I don't know that there's going to be a complete review or sort of consensus review of how Cuomo did. I mean, you could come to the end of this calendar year and the vaccine stuff straightened out and people, it got orderly and a lot of people got vaccinated and things are great, or it could have turned into just a terrible mess. And I think until you kind of finally get through all of that process, I think it would be kind of premature to try to handicap, you know, how it affects him or his future right now.
Mm-hmm. Anyone have thoughts on that? Anyone else?
I would just say that, you know, the governor is very adept at using the behind the scenes levers of power that have been afforded to him in Albany, which are very much. But this coming few months in the debate about raising taxes on the wealthy, I think COVID has really driven a wedge into the divide between Andrew Cuomo, who's more of a fiscal moderate, and some members, especially the state Senate, that are definitely far more progressive, especially in their taxing strategies. So we see a lot of members of the state Senate that are very vocal, Democratic members that are very vocal in criticizing the governor. So that could be something to watch in the future. Whether they have enough political power at this point to maybe take him on in a primary, who knows? But it's definitely going to be something to keep an eye on.
Mhm.
All that takes us back 7 years to going on 8, right? To when Bill de Blasio is running for mayor. And you had this shorter, weird Potemkin process between the primary and the general election. From September all the way to January, we know who the next mayor is going to be, but he's not mayor yet. This year, it's going to be June all the way to January because we moved the primary up. But de Blasio is one, he pretty much knows he's going to be mayor. And he figures, this is my year. Andrew Cuomo's got to run next year. The legislature's all up. I'm going to use this leverage I have. I called for this millionaire's tax, and I'm going to make Cuomo give it to me. And Cuomo's like, I'm running for office. There's no chance of raising taxes, and now I'm going to hate you forever and ever and ever and more. And that sort of began the relationship. And Cuomo has been tormenting the mayor in certain ways and saying, I'm the alpha dog here ever since. Everyone running for mayor, except maybe Andrew Yang, who has not been paying so much attention to New York politics until very recently, is aware of this dynamic, very aware. Andrew Yang's probably heard about it from Corey Johnson, so he knows a little at this point. And so when you're having this millionaire's tax fight going forward, you're going to have a newly elected Democratic mayor of New York with some sort of mandate who, if they're smart, is not going to be baiting Cuomo. If they are, they're taking an incredibly large gamble. Because if there's not some tremendous progressive wave and it's not, say, Governor Giuliani in 2022, if you've spent that year fighting with the governor to get more for New York, even with a Democratic legislature, and you don't get it, you're going to have a governor who's going to want to punish the mayor, even if it's bad for the people in New York City. I think that's one of the object lessons of the last 8 years, and a reason for everyone to proceed with tremendous caution on that front. And again, it creates a very strange dynamic where we have through this election in June, and then maybe for 18 months after that, where all the political forces are slightly out of their usual alignment as those rotate. Before we find out what the consensus it really is for raising taxes on the wealthy, for rebalancing the budget, and like what the range of the possible is in New York now that it is fully and entirely controlled by Democrats and is likely to be for the foreseeable future.
Mhm. What the other question, you mentioned the mayoral race. We have so many candidates now flooding the area, or flooding the field, I should say. And who do you see? Do you see anybody? It is early yet, but anybody emerging as a front runner? I mean, I just saw Eric Adams the other day. I guess it was Sunday as well, running, and he's like all over the place. Yang has got trouble trying to figure out where he is. Any other thoughts on who might be a front runner, or is that too early as well?
I would just say in terms of, Yang, Scott Stringer, Eric Adams, it's late at this point, but it's still, I mean, we're in such a different media landscape because of the pandemic, and we're doing Zoom fundraisers, and it's still almost a name recognition game at this point. And Andrew Yang is obviously winning that game given his presidential campaign. But if you look at the fundraising, it's Scott Stringer, the city controller, and Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams. And yeah, it's going to be an interesting race to watch. Everything is kind of a little different because of the pandemic now, and it'll be interesting to see how this develops.
An issue for Long Island is PSEG and what has been happening with ever since Hurricane I can never say it right, and I should speak for a living. Hurricane Isaias. Do you think that contract is going to be, LIPA will terminate the contract with PSEG? Because
if you go even further to 2011 Hurricane Irene, there's been this dynamic where The governor at that point kind of forced the change in LIPA, and PSEG kind of moved in. But it's been like this recurring story, which is the storm comes, everyone hates the utility company, people talk about change, what exactly changes or not. And I think it's, I don't want to say it's the easiest thing in the world, but it's like common for a storm to happen and the politicians to rail about the company, the operator, but making long-term significant change is often more difficult. And so whether anything happens from here, I don't know. It's a little bit hard to predict right now, but I guess we could say there is precedent of a company that's the grid operator on Long Island being pushed out because of dissatisfaction and other political pressure. So
Yeah,
it's
the
not-
utility becomes an easy whipping boy.
yeah.
Yeah, okay. We have a question from a listener, wants to know about the fact that Biden has this unity theme that he's tried to put forward in his inaugural address, and he's talked about since then. That's a tough one, unity. When you do have people on Long Island who were big Trump supporters. I mean, I can think of my own family members, and they look at what's happening in Washington with the impeachment. What about unity? Is there a way to, I mean, to me, it's a tough question. How do you bring people together? But is this something that's going to be a flash in the pan and we're not going to really see any unity? I mean, he's trying to make it a significant theme of his presidency.
And Carol, I can think back to the press conference we covered with Chuck Schumer on Sunday, where he was talking about the filibuster and the kind of battle between him and the now minority leader, Mitch McConnell, over the future of the filibuster. And I think it just speaks to, the Republicans are trying to hold on to whatever bit of power that they can at this point. And the concept of unity is very different from the physical manifestations of unity. So it's obviously going to be difficult in Washington to come to any kind of unity. We're already kind of seeing those early fights play out here.
Do anybody have an opinion on the Washington Press Corps and how they've handled, how they're handling the new president, President Biden? Are they too soft, do you think, starting out? Or, I mean, because that's what the criticism has been from the right, that the media is going to be too soft on him. They're just going to rubber stamp everything he does. Anybody have an opinion on that?
1 week. And,
Yeah.
and that criticism, which has been
That's never stopped anybody from having an opinion before,
but that's obviously, that criticism is one, being offered plainly in bad faith and ahead of events, and two, there's obviously a seed of truth to, and hopefully the press corps and the people who have been doing this and feeling the tingle up their leg, as I think Chris Matthews did for Hillary Clinton at one point, like calm down and stop signifying and get to work. But it's very early, and I think that's in bad faith. As to the unity stuff, anytime we're having a national conversation about unity and we're not having a foreign war, this is not hooray war, but that's a bad and dangerous sign. Unity is really, we all know this, right? We cover politics, is people can begrudgingly accept the results of systems, how the spoils are getting divvied up and so on, and go about the rest of their lives, and then re-up that fight as a new thing comes up. That's how that's supposed to work. And so there were Nazis in America when I was growing up, for sure. There were a handful in Long Island. There's even some in Manhattan. There still are. And it's not that there's been an exponential growth in the number of Nazis. There's definitely been an exponential growth in conversation about Nazis. And look, we found chat transcripts of what the Nazis are saying, and here are scary things they're doing. The real scary things going on. I'm not trying to be too cute about this, but the actual threat increase is that we seem to be fragile enough as a society that we have to talk about unity, that we're constantly covering relatively small groups of violent disruptors who, again, are not a new phenomenon. The Black Bloc Antifa stuff that people on the right and maybe your Trump supporting family members are deeply concerned with all the time, right? This goes back to Seattle and 2000 and the anti-globalization movement in the 90s. It gets paused because of 9/11 and like new security implementations. Like this stuff never goes away. So these are like chronic conditions. Like, man, I've got a cold. And when you're like, I've got a cold and I'm afraid it's going to kill me, you know, it says something about, you know, your state as a person or as a nation when that's the conversation. So I'm hoping the way we get to unity is that there's no reason to talk about unity because there's a common sense acceptance of how politics are supposed to function. And most people are too busy going about their daily lives to tune into this stuff. Again, as with those briefings, is almost a form of entertainment or distraction, like real television programming that's competing with scripted dramas and sports shows and so on. Like that's bad. Hopefully people get back to normal distractions and you know, their core beliefs and living those out in their own worlds and going about their lives. That would be the real return to unity, while muttering terrible stuff about people they think are wrong and bad.
Right. Yeah, the criticism of and finger pointing is really, geez, it just doesn't seem to stop. And it gets in the way. It gets in the way of conversation. It gets in the way of having a meeting of the minds. You can't when people are pointing fingers. Steve, we're going to add something?
No, I would just say, I mean, I viewed this election as kind of forcing people who've been living in two different realities onto the same playing field, whether they wanted to be there or not. And we saw the result of that, which culminated on January 6th. So it's, yeah, to imagine unity at a time like this is very difficult. And you have the Democrats saying we need to punish the former president in order to get to this unity. So even the route to get to unity is under debate right now. So if that tells you anything about how we're going so far, there it is.
Yeah, really. Would you expect the Long Island senators, you got Lee Zeldin, it looks like they're all going to fall in line and vote against convicting the president? I would think.
Well, just to clarify, it would be the Senate, right? That would be voting.
Right.
So Schumer and Gillibrand.
Oh, that's right.
When
Yeah.
the House brought charges, those
Right.
were largely along partisan lines. So the two Republicans from Long Island, Lee Zeldin and Andrew Garbarino, who's been on the job less than a month, both voted against bringing the charges against the president.
Right. Okay. What about housing? We have this trend on Long Island for housing prices going up. Lots of people moving from the city to Long Island. I guess it's a trend for a while. Do you see that? What kind of an impact that'll have on various things that are going to come down the pike? I'm thinking of like the congestion pricing. You're going to have people living on Long Island. I guess if they don't have to commute on the railroad, they don't have to drive in, some of these issues, how is this going to play out?
That's a good question. You know, if more people are working at home, does traffic on the LIRR, does traffic on the highway ever pick up? And if so, how does that affect a plan that the politicians at Cuomo had endorsed about congestion pricing, because that's a way to generate some money to help the mass transit system, which is everyone's stated goal. I mean, what if that doesn't generate all the money that they were hoping for? Then what? Then what's your answer from there? It again goes back to one of the things we've been talking about, so many decisions kind of delayed and on hold. So there's a lot of pieces to be figured out. This is a big year, not only in Washington, but also Albany. And I'll go back to a point that someone else made a little bit earlier. Probably maybe the biggest flashpoint for the governor and the legislature going through this session is income tax rates for the wealthy. Some say super wealthy, some say millionaires tax, whatever you want to use. But do you set a different rate for folks who earn $1 million a year, $5 million a year, $10 million a year? What rate do you want to set it? Do you not change it at all? Do you wait for Washington? This is going to be one of the biggest philosophical debates in Albany right now. And it's really going to test sort of how blue does a blue state like New York want to be? Are they going to follow the lead of some rank and file legislators who really want to push this issue and raise tax rates on the wealthy? Or is Governor Cuomo, who, by the way, has a lot of control over the state budget and a lot of influence, is he able to get some aid from Washington and convince legislators not to go too far with raising the income tax rates? And a lot of decisions are going to kind of fall out from that. What to do with marijuana taxes, what to do with other sorts of school aid, school taxes, sorts of things. That's maybe the one big issue to watch in New York State politics and governing over the next few months is how does that question get answered, and what are the effects of it?
Mhm. Will the legislature go along with his legalization of recreational marijuana? Because that could be a big moneymaker.
Big, not too big.
You don't think so big? Yeah.
Budgets. If you're talking like 300 million a year or 500 million a year, I mean, you have to consider the state budget is like $190 billion. So it's only a
But
small.
it would be found money.
But yes, they are trying to patch together every bit of money that they want. Here's the thing on marijuana. Again, it comes down to money and how to use it. If I dare say, if you just took a poll of the 213 state legislators, do you think recreational marijuana should be legalized? And that was your only question. I'm pretty sure a majority would say yes. But now the question is, what structure do you legalize it? How much do you tax it? At what rate? And where does all the money go from the taxation? The governor wants to put it all in what's called the general fund, which he has a lot of control over. And state legislators want to be more prescriptive about how to use that money, sending it especially to communities that have been impacted by the war on drugs, and making sure that those communities get a big portion of whatever money is generated here. And so, again, it's not the philosophical, should we legalize it? It's more like, okay, we think we want to legalize it. Who's getting all the proceeds? Who's getting the proceeds?
Right. Steve, you're going to say something?
I would add, I know this is a New York forum, but just look at what's happening in New Jersey right now. They tried in the legislature to legalize for 2 years. They couldn't get it done, so they put it to the voters in a referendum. It passed overwhelmingly. They were supposed to have some kind of legal structure in place by the new year. That wasn't done. They eventually passed some bills. It got to the governor's desk. He went through the fine print, saw some things he didn't like, and so now they're kind of back at square one. So it's far easier said than done when you talk about legalizing marijuana.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Harry?
It's all these things that we're looking at there, as Nancy was saying, right? So legalizing marijuana, maybe further expansion of gambling, which is very, very technically barred by a New York state constitution, which is, a meaningless document. Those are marginal things, or cash under the couch here. I mean, it's crazy. It's 190 billion for the state. It's half that much again for the city. Yes, some of that money, is coming from the feds, but then there are all these other pools of money. So $500 million here and $500 million there. It's at the margins of real money, but the real test of what's coming, and frankly, anyone who wants to gamble can like make their way to New Jersey and gamble on their phone. Anyone who really needs to get a high right now and legally can drive to Massachusetts and deal with that. It's going to come down to how much the feds are offering and how much more we're willing to tax the wealthy. And at a moment of uncertainty for the wealthy, like everyone else, and almost all the other considerations are from a big policy standpoint, like marginal or rounding errors. Obviously, for certain people's lives, there'll be a tremendous consequence. But that's the big show, and all the other decisions do sort of spell out, I think, from that.
Mm-hmm. We have about 10 minutes left. If you want to sort of put out there something that you would like to see happen in terms of how we report things, and also if there's an issue that you're hoping will really crystallize a little bit more. I know we all have our subjects that we like and those that we don't, Steve, you want to start off with that?
Yeah, I mean, when I think about subjects that I try to highlight, it's transportation is definitely one of them. And New York has fallen far behind in terms of innovating its transportation infrastructure. And I think back to the end of last month, about a month ago, when the governor was at the new Moynihan train hall to open that up. And that was the end of a 27-year bureaucratic nightmare to see that come into the light of day. But it was really nothing more than a giant waiting room. It didn't do anything to improve capacity at Penn Station in terms of getting trains in and out. So I think that's going to be one of the big issues to watch in New York is how we innovate our transportation infrastructure for subways. It's getting the signals modernized so trains can run closer together. For commuter rail, it's East Side Access and the Long Island Railroad, which is another multi-decade bureaucratic nightmare, along with the gateway tunnels, the governor's Penn South proposal, which involves taking some buildings just south of Penn Station. We don't know exactly how that's going to work out. There's a lot of proposals and plans on the table, but getting them to the point of putting shovels in the ground seems to be New York's big issue. And then after that, New York's big issue is just hugely out of line cost for all of these projects. So it's going to be a challenge, and it's something New York needs to work on if it wants to stay in its reputation as one of the world's leading cities.
Right. Harry?
Piggybacking off of what Steve just said, I'd really like to see an honest reckoning. And if we're ever going to have one, it's been 50 years and we have not. This is the moment with mental illness and supportive housing. So train ridership is down 80%. Trains are closing at night in the city that never sleeps. Crime rates are about stable. Really, really scary stories about people getting shoved onto the tracks and so on, or if anything, up a little. And without the hum and function of the ordinary city behind it, you know, it's exposed very directly the issues with seriously mentally ill people who we no longer have like vast state institutions to put them inside of for good and for ill, aren't generally willing to forcefully medicate with Kendra's law for good or for ill, but are instead just sort of leaving out there to suffer and struggle on their own and generally really hurt themselves and occasionally hurt or terrify other New Yorkers. And this is a moral failing that has lasted for a very long time, that has been harder and harder to ignore over the last year. And I'm really hopeful that we might have some sort of honest reckoning with the next mayor of this issue. The catch, of course, being, and what's kept us away for 50 years, once all those institutions were closed, is that doing anything to help people with supportive housing or otherwise is very expensive. And consequently, it's just been easier to sort of pass the buck, let the police deal with this here and there, and to just let people like marinate in their own suffering without really providing help. I hope that changes. I think there is actually a chance now.
That would be nice. That is one of my pet subjects. It's scary. It's personal in many ways, and it's out there. And like you say, we've just allowed it to be, because nobody wants to touch it. Yancey?
Well, you know, I mean, politically, besides trying to figure out as we mentioned, the tax rates and how that's going to trigger a lot of stuff. I think the other political story to watch in Albany is balance of power. When this hit, the legislature gave the governor extraordinary powers to act, change the budget, shift money all around, because the argument was we're in this pandemic and it needs to be able to do something immediately, not just, you know, call 200 legislators to session and figure out something. And I think everybody went along with that, but there has been some chafing about that, and whether the legislature gave the governor too much power, whether it should have had an end date, a certain end date on that power. That's going to kind of be a subtext of everything that gets discussed here, along with the tax rates. But again, that's going to be background to sort of the forefront story here, which is, you know, COVID, rolling out the vaccines, trying to get enough people vaccinated, and deal with any variants that develop from there. That's, you know, even though all these other stories are important and interesting, but I think the focus is still going to be COVID and the pandemic and the vaccines, and everything else kind of working in the background of that.
Right. And if they eventually open up more in the city, Long Island is open a little bit more, but once things start opening up, then those other issues, I think, come toward the front. I think you're right about that. Well, I want to thank everybody. I do appreciate everybody being here. We want to thank the Fair Media Council for allowing this to happen, and I hope we got to everybody's questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Here's a chance to take a coffee break. We'll begin our next panel shortly.